All right, so chapter 14. I know you guys have been jonesing for this I know I have. It's been like, what do we need? Oh, we need a model. We definitely need a model. We need someone walking down the runway, showing that they have a very trim waistline and that they're attractive in any way, shape, or form, whether they're wearing a dish towel or a wonderful wedding dress. That's not the way it works? All right, so what we need to talk about is the macro level supply and demand. So back in chapter 3 and 4, we talked about the micro level supply and demand, where we were talking about one industry's product and how did prices and quantities work out for that particular company. All right? Nice little thing to do at the micro level, but should it apply to the macro level? Why not? We don't necessarily want it to, but it definitely needs to, especially since last chapter, what were we talking about? We were talking about inflation and prices. You guys must really want to know what's going on with prices, right? Undoubtedly you do. So we need to figure out how to make that work. So, first thing we have to do when we start drawing supply and demand is to have our axes labeled, right? So back in the micro world, we had P and Q. The cool thing about it is it's really still P and Q. It's just that the price at the macro level is a little weird, right? So instead of there being prices, how do we measure prices at the macro level? In other words, what did we talk about last chapter? Inflation. What's inflation based off of? So prices at the macro level, CPI. So it looks like I'm putting something new up there, but I'm not. It's just prices, okay? It's just prices at the entire economy level. All right? So you're probably thinking then, well, if prices are up here, quantity should be down here. You're absolutely right. But how do we measure the quantity of all final goods and services produced in an economy? GDP. So again, it looks new because we're calling it CPI and GDP. And it should always say real GDP. Realize that I'm going to dump this real fast. So it's just, I'll probably wind up misspelling it if I leave it up there too long. So it's just going to be GDP, but realize I mean real GDP all the time, okay? So this is always normalized GDP so that we can compare it from year to year as we need to, all right? So we at least have our axes set up. Now, it's almost always easier to start with demand. So let's start with demand. So demand at the macro level. The idea here is that we want to take up the demand for every product that we produce and service, right? Every product and service that we produce in a given year in our boundary, and that's what we want to measure how much demand there is for it. Now, please bear with me because you need to learn some vocabulary. This is known as aggregate demand. Demand at the macro level is just called aggregate demand because what does the word aggregate mean? If you aggregate a bunch of numbers, what are you going to do with them? You're going to add them all up. So aggregate demand is the sum of all demand in our economy. Okay? Guess how we abbreviate aggregate demand? Yeah. So when you label your demand at the macro level, or when you put demand on the CPI and GDP graph or model, whatever you wish, please use the phrase AD instead of just D, okay? When you just put D down there for demand, that makes it look like it's a microeconomic level entity, and that's, you really want to distinguish it, separate the two, right? Differentiate the micro world from the macro world. So not only are you going to change your labels on your graph, you are also going to change the labels on your lines, okay? And again, they're lines. Don't worry too much about curves. The book will draw some curves. You can deal with them. But for me, everything's going to be straight lines. It's always nice straight lines. All right. So how do you think I should draw my demand curve? How did I draw just about every other demand curve I ever worked with before? Yoink! Nicely enough, demand hasn't changed, folks. If you add up a bunch of curves that look like this, you're going to get a curve that looks like this. Okay? It would suck if the demand curve looked different, because then we would have to differentiate even more, and we don't have to, right? The nice thing about it is demand is demand is demand is even aggregate demand, okay? Now, you may be a little bit leery looking at that going, well, you know, Marshall, I can sort of understand demand being this downward sloping curve when it's just one product that we're buying, right? When the price goes up, I buy less. That makes sense. But why is it that when prices on average are going up, we as an economy produce less? That seems a little, that's pushing it maybe a little bit, right? I mean, kind of makes sense, but you kind of have to somehow encompass the entire economy around GDP. And so you may say, well, Marshall, you know, you tell a mean story, but I don't necessarily buy it yet. Okay, so why is AD like a regular D? All right, well, there's three standard reasons why we say that this, you know, sort of works this way. Okay, the first one is called the real balances effect. Basically, this one, the way you can envision this one is, imagine, if you will, you were living on a fixed income, right? So, you know, you're retired, and you're living off of your pension, and your pension is going to be, you know, $2,000 a month, right? That's what the government has decided that you're going to get, because that's how much you worked throughout your life. So here comes your Social Security check once a month, $2,000. Social Security doesn't necessarily have very good cost of living, you know, changes in it. It's got a little bit, but it's like, yeah, it's really bad. If you've ever had to deal with it or know someone who has it, it's not so good. So the question then is, when these people start to see prices going up, when you have a fixed income and prices go up, what do you have to do when you don't make more money? You have to buy less. You still spend the same amount, right? I mean, you still have to go to the store and buy groceries, but if the groceries cost 5% more, what do you have to do? Yeah, one, you shop a little bit harder, you cut a little bit more. I mean, basically, you have to buy a little bit less. You have to stretch the dollars that you have a little bit more, right? So either you buy the same amount of food and then you don't go to any movies, or you figure out how to, you know, to coupon cut and maybe get that money some other way so that you can still do some of the fun things that you have. But otherwise, I mean, you're screwed, right? You've got to live first, right? If the rent in your apartment goes up by 10%, can you just leave? Not unless your car is really toasty and warm. And, you know, you as a 65 to 70-year-old person can handle sleeping on a car mattress. It's doable, right? Don't want to, though, right? So So the key here is, imagine having a fixed income. Higher prices means you buy less, and so less GDP is created. Simply because you just can't buy this stuff. I mean, that's all there is to it. So this sort of says, as prices go up, my GDP is going to go down. Or as prices go down, I will buy more stuff, right? If the price of, if my apartment all of a sudden goes down 10% in price, which I've never lived anywhere where the price of my rent has gone down, ever. Has anyone ever? You had it happen once?
Yeah, they changed out all the windows and everything else, and it dropped the rent down like $10, $20.
Nice. Energy-wise?
Yeah.
So that you were covering energy costs, and so by doing this, there you go. It can happen, folks. Yeah, I've never seen it, but you know, it could be. All right. Another reason why. The interest rate effect. Again, as inflation rises, what happens to the real interest rate? As inflation, or CPI, rises, real interest rate falls. When the real interest rate falls, do we save more money? No, because the interest rates are small, right? If interest rates are zero, why would we bother saving any money? And we save less, so less investment occurs. And when there's less investment, what happens to GDP? Think about it. Think about what's the formula for GDP? C plus I, which is business investment, right? So this real balance effect is saying that when prices go up, consumers buy less. When prices go up, interest rates fall, businesses save less, they invest less. G, government. Is government going to give a crap about inflation? Governments are notoriously stupid, so they don't. But who else might affect it, right? Who else might notice? What's the last portion of GDP? C plus I plus G plus? Net export. So what are foreign people going to do when they notice our prices rising? They're going to export less, right? They're going to buy less of our products, right? So our third effect is the export effect. And for us, this means higher U.S. prices. Higher prices in the U.S. means less exports. And it also means more imports, right? I mean, think about Americans. When prices of American goods are going up, for the cheapest place that we can buy stuff, right? Well, if our prices are going up and China's prices are staying fixed, we start walking on over to China. I mean, we're swimming, maybe, whatever. I mean, less exports and more imports. But either way, remember, exports has a plus sign in front of it. What does imports have in front of it? Minus sign. So if we have more imports, what happens to GDP? Right? and thus less GDP. And again, this last one is the x minus m portion. So really, all of the effects are just the different areas of GDP, C plus I plus G plus x minus m, saying that when prices go up, all of us go down, period. So that should at least make you feel slightly like you believe me, that aggregate demand is this nice downward sloping curve, okay? All right. Okay, so there's demand. Now, supply is different. Straight up. So bear with me. Okay, so supply, this pen sucks. Okay, so supply at the macro level. If supply if demand at the macro level was aggregate demand, guess what supply at the macro level is? Aggregate supply. And again, abbreviate it with AS. All right. Now, aggregate demand was exactly like we expected it. Aggregate supply, folks, is not. Sorry. You knew there had to be some kind of a twist. If it was exactly the same, then this class would be, just a rinse and repeat of chapter 3 and 4, and that would be too nice. Sorry. All right, so turns out that aggregate supply has 3 stages based on the state of the economy. And I put state in quotes so that you wouldn't think it was something like Wisconsin versus Texas versus California versus New York. It would be nice if it was strictly driven off of geographical state, but it's not. All right? It's the overall basic state of the economy. All right, now, I'm going to give you the 3 stages and try and explain them to some degree, so bear with me as I go through it, all right? So the first stage is called the Keynesian stage. This is Keynes, from John Maynard Keynes, who is an English economist who back in the 30s came up with a new way at economics. All right, so John Maynard Keynes, who is really the guy who set the stage for economics over the past literally 90 years. I mean, he's set the stage for how we have changed the way economics used to work. All right, so the Keynesian stage it's the stage of the economy when we are in the throes of nastiness, when we are in a really bad recession or a depression. So, let me try and set the stage for you here. So imagine, if you will, that it's late 2008, early 2009. GDP has fallen we've moved from being in a good spot in GDP to a spot where it's not so good. All right? Now, when we are in a depression, can businesses raise prices? They can, but what ends up happening? They don't sell squat, and so they keep prices pretty stable. Now, why can businesses get away with that in a depression? Businesses, folks, they're going to make money, period, okay? That's the micro side of things. We know that their goal is profit, profit, and profit. And businesses hurt for a little while in the economy back in the 08-09 recession, but not really for as long as everyone seems to think it is, right? Why? They couldn't raise prices, but what did they do? I mean, what happened to everybody during 2008, 2009? They got laid off, right? So what were businesses doing in order to make more money? They weren't selling more. They were spending less. Because there was no need to produce a whole bunch of goods because nobody was going to buy them anyways, right? Why crank out 10,000 shirts a month when you were only going to sell 1,000 of them anyways? Why crank out 1,000 pairs of shoes when you're only going to sell 200 of them, right? So what did these companies do? They said, well, we're not going to keep cranking out 1,000 of them, so we're only going to crank out 200, take the worst people in our lines and say, see you later, goodbye. Right, you're laid off. And on top of it, those businesses said, okay, here we are down here at this stage of the economy. Prices are staying pretty stable. They're not going up because the businesses can't bring them up. So let's imagine, if you will, that the economy starts to improve, so GDP starts to go up. Right? So the businesses are starting to try and produce a bit more. Now, they've laid off 40, 50, 60% of their staff. Now all of a sudden they start to get orders, right? Because GDP is going up, which is what's happened over the last 3 years. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you look at, how does the business get additional production? Does it hire new people? No. Overtime, right? So when they start paying you overtime, are they still making profit? Oh, hell yeah, folks. I mean, they're making lots of profit, right? The whole point of it is as soon as they start getting more orders, what do they do to the people who are making the orders? Well, I mean, one, they tell the people who are making the orders, it's going to cost you a little bit more, not a lot, but a little bit to pay for my overtime that I have to pay my employees, right? But it's not going to cost you a lot of money because I don't have to hire anybody, right? So they say, great, you need to have, 500 extra shoes next month from my factory. Great. Amanda, Carissa, you guys, 60-hour work weeks. And since you guys were just watching a recession and potentially were laid off, what did you say? Yeah, overtime, time and a half, right? You danced all the way to the bank. Granted, you had to work a 60-hour week, but you're like, I don't care, I'm making time and a half. Woohoo, I can eat and I can actually pay my rent and I can maybe invest, and et cetera, right? I mean, you're excited. And then, the same thing keeps happening, right? The economy keeps growing, and now all of a sudden Jeremy has to work 60 hours, and Hannah has to work 60 hours, and Joe even has to work a 60-hour week. Sorry, Joe. Right? Eventually, though, what happens to you guys all working 60-hour weeks for 6 or 7 or 8 straight weeks? You won't go on strike because you're still nervous. You still remember the recession. But you start getting burned out, right? And your productivity starts to drop a little bit, and you start getting tired. And what do? You call in, or you look for a better job, right? You're looking for, it's like, okay, yeah, I'm making $15 an hour, but, if I could just find a job that paid, like, say, $18 an hour, I could say only work a 40-hour week, and yeah, I might have to take a little mini pay cut, but a 40-hour week sure would be nice after 2 straight months of a 60-hour week, and I'm a little on the tired side, and my kids don't know my name anymore, and right? So eventually, you find a new job, you quit. When you start quitting those jobs that are paying you time and a half and finding the job that has, then they start hiring, and once companies have to start hiring, then they have to start raising prices. And once prices start going up, we move to stage 2. So for a long time during a recession or a depression, prices will stay stable. They may even drop a little bit. There may be a little bit of deflation. And it's purely because the businesses can fleece the employees for as long as they're going to be able to, right? And what really has to happen in order for a recession to be over is for people to give the company the finger and quit, because then they have to hire new people, right? Of course, usually in order to quit, you have a job somewhere else. Again, you still haven't forgotten what it was like to live on unemployment for a little while, and that sucks, okay? When you're just barely making it or slipping behind, you're not going to go back to that, right? So you don't quit, and you may think you can go on strike, Jeremy, but you really can't, because you know it's going to be dangerous, right? So finally, we move along and we say, okay, prices can start going up. We get out of the Keynesian range, and we get into what's standardly called the intermediate stage. So down here, we are in the Keynesian stage. Keynes. And I know it's spelled Keynes, but Keynes with an A. And as GDP grows, right, again, remember that businesses are producing more, so GDP is growing, right? At some stage, the growth in GDP spurs prices to rise, okay? So demand is going up. We all start to have money to spend. And instead of businesses being able to make more money by hiring cheap labor, they have to pay for more. Prices start to go up. And this should look to you like a good old regular supply curve. And that's really what the intermediate stage is normal supply, right? Where as prices go up, so does GDP, right? So from a worker's perspective, right? So this is the stage of aggregate supply where we have recovered from a recession or a depression. And again, let's put it in frame of what we've been going through the last 4 years, right? So imagine, if you will, that you find that new job that's now paying you $18 to $20 an hour, and you're now back to working a good old 40 to 45 hour a week job. And you actually know who your kids are, and you can still eat at the same time, right? So you're good. Are you satisfied once you find that job? Of course not, right? I mean, we're never really satisfied. But the reason that we're really not satisfied right here is that we remember what it was like a little bit ago to be in a recession when we were living on nothing. So we're saying, look, we need to find a better job that's going to pay us a little bit more even so we can start saving up before the next recession starts. Because it would be nice to have a larger cushion before, the crap hits the fan again, because it's going to, because now you've seen it happen once, now you're afraid it's going to happen all the time. And that's really kind of the way it works, all right? So you keep looking, and potentially you keep finding new jobs, right? So maybe you find a job that's paying you $25 an hour because there's demand out there for you. And, you used to be down here at 18 bucks an hour, and, eventually that company, what's it going to start doing? Instead of trying to hire people, what's it going to do to you? This process never changes, right? The company's always going to do the same thing. They're going to try and get the most out of you and earn the most profit they can from you. That's their damn job, right? So your job is to figure out how much you're willing to take before you go yoink and move to the next job, okay? Which is why you never stop looking. So you give up that $20 an hour job, you get up here to the $25 an hour job, and you're like, sweetness, awesome. And you're putting in a 40-hour week, and every now and then they ask for 50, but, at time and a half at 25 bucks an hour, you're just like, I mean, Again, though, that's costing the company much, much more, so they're less likely to do that. They would rather keep things relatively stable at that stage. And you're relatively happy at $25 an hour, but are you satisfied? You are not satisfied. Okay? You're going to keep looking because you still remember that 4 or 5 or 6 years ago there was a recession and I need to be able to have more in my nest egg. I don't have 8 paychecks worth of money sitting in my bank account and a full 401k and a full Roth IRA and a new car and a new yacht and a... You guys are all going to have a yacht eventually again, right? Right, Brandon? Okay, well, maybe the first time. Whatever. Anyways, though, eventually, though, let's suppose that you find the ultimate job for $30 an hour. And it is the ultimate job. It's you went to school for it. You enjoy doing it. They don't ask you to work 45 or 50 hours a week. They ask you to work 40 hours a week. And they're paying you $30 an hour, and you're getting benefits. And they're matching, up to 3% of your 401k investment. And you're like, wow. You're excited, right? But do you forget the fact that you were in a recession 7 or 8 years ago? So do you quit looking entirely? You never quit looking, folks. You always glance every now and then. You get the classifieds, or maybe you go to WisconsinJobs.com, and you're kind of leafing through them, and you're like, I wouldn't mind $35 or $45 an hour, right? I mean, that wouldn't suck. So let's suppose that at some stage after you found the perfect job where, you're working, your neighbors are working, your kids are all working, your parents are working, your cousins and your brothers and all of your nephews are working, basically everybody's working. And you're not really worried about money necessarily, but more never hurts. So you keep looking. And maybe you see it, right? Maybe you see the ultimate job, right? Right now maybe you're commuting 30 minutes to get to work. But you see the job that's paying you maybe $2 or $3 extra, and it's like right across the street from where you live. You could walk to work. And they're going to have a cafeteria. You're not going to have to cook your own lunch or, have ramen noodles for lunch or whatever. Are you going to apply for that job? Yeah. Are you going to get paid $35 to $40 an hour when you get that job? Because, of course, you all will. You'll get it. Are you being more productive, though? If you're doing exactly the same thing and all you're doing is getting paid more to do it. So is GDP going up when you get this new job? No. But what happens when you start getting paid more? What does that business have to do? It's got to make a profit. What does it have to do? If it's paying its employees more, what does it have to do? It has to raise prices. So GDP didn't go up, but you got paid more, but unfortunately prices all went up with you. Suppose you find another job, same thing, doing the exact same thing, $50 an hour, and now it's in your bedroom because now they've let you telecommute. You never even have to get dressed and you can go to work. You can go to work in your underwear and get paid $50 an hour. Are you going to take it? Of course you are. Who wouldn't want to be able to do their job in their underwear? As long as there weren't a whole bunch of other people with you. Unless they're your kids, then it's okay. Right? So you take that job. Again, are you being more productive because you got to stay at home? No. Because they're paying you more, what's going to happen? Prices are going to go up. So what happens is that the third stage let me put it here since we're out of room over there. This is what's called the classical stage. Where, yes, you can get paid more money, but if you're not being more productive, if you're not producing more than you were doing in a different job, you're not necessarily adding to GDP. And since you're not adding to GDP, the extra money you're earning, all it's doing is making more inflation. All right? And the classical stage, this This is the full employment stage, right? Everybody's got a job. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't find a new job that pays you more, but when you do find that new job that pays you more, it's not really paying you more, it's just making prices go up, right? Once you do find your ultimate job, would you just please be happy? I know it's hard to forget the recessions and the layoffs and the living on unemployment, but once you're in heaven, just stay there. Getting above heaven just means that somebody else is looking up your skirts. Okay, that's maybe a little overboard, but you get my point, right? Once you are being as productive as you can be, it's not going to necessarily help to get paid more to do the same thing. I mean, yes, it is, but realize that this is what it's going to cause, right? It's going to cause inflation because the people who are paying you have to pay for the fact that they're paying you more, and hence prices have to go up. All right. So once we hit full employment, that's where more work, more job isn't necessarily going to be a good thing. All right. Again, it's one of those where, if it takes inflation a while to catch up with you, maybe it's okay, but eventually it will. All right. So these are your 3 stages. Please remember them. Kick. Spell it the right order. All right. Keynesian, recession. Intermediate, recovery from recession. Classical, recovered. And the key here is that based on where the economy is, that's where aggregate demand hits aggregate supply. Okay? So when we are in a recession, the key is that you draw aggregate supply first, and then you put aggregate demand in the recession stage. If I tell you that we are recovering from a recession, you will say, put aggregate demand in the recovering from recession stage. So now there's a little bit of a caveat to our drawing of supply and demand in that the stage of the economy dictates where supply and demand are hitting. All right? It's a bit of a twist, but the idea is that these are the way supply looks in those stages. So it makes sense that aggregate demand is somewhere in there.
So then that's basically going to just keep repeating itself.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that right now, we, current times, are sitting somewhere right around here, right? Have maybe recovered from our recession, maybe not, but we're pretty close to the kink where we're switching from Keynesian to intermediate, right? And so if you guys do go out and find a new job and get paid more, there's a good chance that you will be producing more, but once you start producing more, what's going to come along with your extra production? Extra prices. Whereas 2 or 3 years ago, when aggregate demand was over here, and you found a new job that paid you more, we could have seen more production. You may have gotten paid more, but prices may have stayed stable because we were still in that recessive type of stage. We hadn't quite recovered yet. All right? And this is exactly why a lot of economists don't think we've recovered, because we're not seeing any inflation yet. A true recovery would say we're in the intermediate stage, and when we see growth in GDP or aggregate demand, we should see growth in prices along with it. And that's the other reason why right now most economists agree we aren't recovered, right? Part of it is that, well, unemployment's not quite low enough. Part of it is that we're not seeing aggregate demand grow fast enough, right? That whole 3.5% growth in aggregate demand, we're not seeing that. But the number one thing that economists are looking for is really this corner being turned, right? To see that prices have started to rise, that demand has gotten strong enough that businesses feel they can raise prices instead of firing more people to make profit. Are we there yet? I don't know. Right? If I knew, like I said, I'd be in on an island in the Cayman somewhere, enjoying some sort of a drink with an umbrella, saying, "Gosh, teaching was hard," but knowing me is as easy in theory. It's not, but it would be nice. All right. So this is the way aggregate supply looks It's not necessarily good or bad per se, but this is the way to see it. All right. So now we need to start playing around with it a little bit. So we've set the stage for aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now, if you think about it, let's go back to chapter 3 and 4, when we first started talking about supply and demand. After I first talked about demand, what did I talk about right after it? What was that, Jeremy? Non-price determinants. I started talking about a change in demand versus a change in quantity demanded. Remember that, annoying argument where you guys were like, what? You're saying the same damn thing. And I was like, no, I'm not. And we tried to have a debate as to what was what. So does that happen here in the aggregate world? Yes. All right, so what moves the aggregate demand curve? Or what are our non-price determinants of aggregate demand, right? Think non-CPI. Remember that price at the macro level is CPI, right? So non-CPI determinants. Determinants. Is that how you spell it? Determinants? I think it is. Of aggregate demand. So, how many of the non-price determinants of demand can you rattle off from the first half of this class? I would always write them on the board, but you guys probably remember them. What was the first one? Number of buyers, right? Because remember, number of buyers, number of sellers. What was number 2? 2 all beef patty, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed. Tastes and preferences, advertising, right? What was number 3? Income. What was number 4? Number 4 was the weird one, was the same on both sides. Future price expectation, right? Whether the buyer expects the price to go up or down or the seller thinks the price to go up or down. And what was the last one? Of a complement or a substitute. Right? Those were our non-price determinants of regular old demand. So, do you think the number of buyers in aggregate demand is going to change a whole lot? I mean, this is like everybody in the United States. So if we have a big, huge population boom, would that, like we had a big, huge advertisement that said, everybody go out and get pregnant, and that would make aggregate demand grow faster? There was a while where we used to think that, but unfortunately it's not really true. Okay, so the question then is, how do we measure how much people demand stuff? In other words, what might we call the amount of consumer goods that people buy? I mean, how do we determine how much a consumer spends? What do we do? We add all the purchasing up, right? I mean, we just add it all up. We add it all up and say this is how much month this month, and then to see if consumer spending is growing or falling, what do? We compare it to month, right? And we say, oh, consumer spending went up, right? So consumer spending appears to be a measurement of demand. Makes sense, right? Well, who else other than consumers buys stuff? Think circular flow model. Businesses. So maybe businesses may invest in stuff, and that investment purchases leads to more prices going up, right? So more businesses that are building office buildings, the higher price office buildings will be, right? So Again, businesses investing more would lead to more demand of office spaces, which would lead to more demand for offices available, right? So consumer spending, business investment, what do you think might be the next thing that drives demand? C plus I plus... So maybe it's the government spending out there, right? So maybe government drives aggregate demand as well, right? So if the government starts buying toilet seats because they need them, or desks, or pens, or whatever, would that potentially push up aggregate demand for all products? Sure it would. What comes after government spending? Exports and imports, right? So if more foreign countries were buying our goods, that would say the demand for our goods is on the rise, right? And if we were buying more imports, would that mean that demand for our goods is going up? In fact, we would be saying that if there were imports, the demand for our goods would be going down, because what's in front of imports? Negative sign. So the non-price determinants of aggregate demand are just the formula for GDP. So C, consumer spending. So if I tell you that consumers are spending more money, you will tell me that aggregate demand is growing. I. If businesses are investing in new factories, new cranes, new office equipment, etc., again, you would tell me that aggregate demand is increasing. If I told you that government was cutting spending because government is trying to balance its budget, so it's spending less money, what would you say is happening to aggregate demand? Right. Less government spending means less aggregate demand, because now the government's not buying crap anymore, right? They used to be buying shoes for $80,000 a pair, but now they're not, and so that company has to sell them somewhere else. And now they maybe even have to sell it at a reasonable price. If I tell you that we're exporting more goods to the rest of the world because the rest of the world's economy is growing faster than ours, you would say good, because then our demand for our goods would be rising, right? One of the things that a lot of our companies are waiting for is the rest of the world to finally pull its head out of its ass and start growing again so that we can start selling them shit again, right? Same sort of a thing. That's why China loves it when we grow, because where do they sell all their goods? China went through a nasty recession because it took a year for our imports from them to finally fall, right? Why did I put a star next to imports? Inverse relationship. All of these guys are direct. If consumer spending goes up, aggregate demand goes up. If business investment goes up, aggregate demand goes up. If government spending goes up, aggregate demand goes up. If imports go up, aggregate demand goes down. This is the only one that has an inverse relationship, right? And again, do not be surprised if I try and trick you with this by saying that imports are falling. If imports are going down, what's happening to aggregate demand? It's always going the opposite direction, right? So just for imports. That's the only one that's got a minus sign in the formula for GDP, right? So really, your non-price determinants of aggregate demand are driven off of the formula for... And that's why a lot of times you will hear people talking about aggregate demand and GDP and sort of slipping back and forth between using the same terms to mean the same thing, right? Because they really, really, really are closely related. All right. So what moves you along the aggregate demand curve? All of these things move the entire curve. What moves you along the curve? What about the goods and services? Here's aggregate demand. What moves me from this point to this point? So the whole curve didn't move. We just used to be at this point. Here was CPI and here was GDP. What would move me to there? Yes, prices going up. Period, right? All of these things are non-CPI determinants. So they're just like those other things were non-price determinants. And when we moved along a demand curve back in Chapter 3, it's because the price went up. Same thing applies here, folks. If prices go up, GDP falls, we move along the aggregate demand curve to a new point. All right? So when prices go up, don't tell me that demand goes down. Once you become a politician, you can say that, because then it's okay to be an idiot. But in this class, it's not okay to be an idiot. When prices go up, you tell me that quantity goes down, period. Okay? All right. So, what moves the supply curve? Again, think non-CPI determinants of aggregate supply. All right, so what were our non-price determinants of supply back in the micro world? Number of sellers, first one, that was sort of a giveaway. Future price expectations is in there, that's for sure. Technology. Cool thing about it, technology applies at the aggregate level as well. It's just that this is technology that all businesses can enjoy, right? So the idea here would be computers, right? Computers made just about every business more profitable or more productive, so they could supply more, all right? What else was there? Resource prices. Those have stayed the same. Resource prices are still a factor of or a non-price determinant of supply. Again, please realize that these are aggregate level resources. So stuff like oil prices, electricity prices, it's not going to be the price of a manicure. That's not going to raise or lower aggregate supply. What else was there? Taxes and subsidies, yay! Those actually get different lines here at this level. They're really, they're still the same thing. Again, think of these, though, at the macro level and not the micro level. So taxes at the micro level would be a tax on gas or a tax on shoes or a tax on haircuts or suntans or whatever, right? These are taxes at everybody's level. So this would be income taxes, corporate taxes. Those sorts of things are the things that fix aggregate supply. And really, these are really corporate level things, okay? Subsidies, we would like to think that the government subsidizes buyers, but they never really do. Again, subsidies are really only paid at a corporate level. Again, this is like that whole You guys remember the car buyback thing where the government would give you like $5,000 if you would buy a new car? Lots of people thought, well, wasn't that a subsidy for the people? And I was like, no. The government never sent you a check when you bought a new car. The government sent the business a check because they sold you a new car. And then you had to give them an old car that they could say, oh, I'll give you $5,000 off on the purchase of your new car in order to buy, in order to get rid of your old car, right? And then the business had to take the car and crush it, right? Even though if it may have still been useful, right? Why would a government want to do that? Make you want to buy a new product. Why would a government want you to do that? Increase GDP, exactly. Why would they want you to crush an old car? So people won't buy it again. It eliminates an option for purchasing a used good. What does used good purchases do for the economy? Nothing. Get rid of the old things, right? Again, the government would love it if every time you were done with something, you burned it or blew it up or whatever, right? I mean, because then you would have to go buy something new, and that would help GDP, and the economy would be all happy, joy, joy again, right? We would be. So when you're done with this pair of clothes, folks, don't wash it, burn it. Okay, there's one more that fits at this level, and it puts up, just because it's something that you definitely hear about floating around at the macro level, and enough businesses complain about it, mainly because you hear politicians complain about it, right? That regulations are one of the things that halt economic growth, right? Or realize that both of these things are bad, right? The more taxes that a company has to pay, or the more regulations that a company has put on them, the less they will supply. So those three really have stars next to them, because if there's more of any of those three, aggregate supply shifts left, okay? It drops. Because, of course, if businesses have to pay more to produce stuff, they're going to produce less. If they have to pay more to sell stuff, they're going to produce less. If they're going to have to fill out more forms to produce stuff, they will produce less. Right? Every form that a business has to fill out apparently costs them $1 billion in profit, or something along those lines. So, again, just like back in chapter 3 and 4, I am going to set the economy for you. Except this time I'm going to set the economy with what stage are we in. So I will say, we are in a nasty recession right now. And when you go to draw your aggregate supply and demand curve, you will now know where to put aggregate demand, right? You put it in the Keynesian range. And then I will tell you something that moves one of the two. You will move one of the two of them, and then tell me what happens to prices and GDP. Just like we did back in chapter 3. All right? So let's try one for today right now, and then we'll call it a day. All right, so we are almost recovered / maybe we are recovered from a recession. So I have set the table. This is the state of the economy. You read that government plans to reduce spending by 20%. And I say, tell me what happens to CPI, GDP, and employment. Why did I ask those three things? What are those three things? I think the very, 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 very first thing that I said after the midterm. What did we talk about? Very, very, very first thing. Before we even started talking about GDP. It's three things. Goals of the macroeconomy. What are the three goals of the macroeconomy? Growth, i.e. GDP. Full employment, i.e. what happens to employment. And what happened to CPI. The goal of the macroeconomy is always to be playing around with one of these three things. Hopefully all three if you can be lucky. Okay? So, and what does this first two sentences sound like to you guys? Sounds like about where we are right now, right? I mean, didn't we just have a big, huge, debt ceiling / government is too far in debt scream off about what we need to do in order to fix the economy? This is what they told us, right? Or at least some groups of people told us. So, what would be our analysis to us agreeing to do that? So, here's CPI, here's GDP, and remember this is real, but I'm going to misspell it, so I'm not going to do it. First thing you draw is aggregate supply, okay, and always draw it kinked. So think kinky, right? So there's your Keynesian range, there's your intermediate stage, there's your classical stage. That's aggregate supply. And then you break out a new color. Where do I put aggregate demand? Somewhere right in here. I mean, if we're almost recovered, maybe you want to put it just a little bit to the left. If you think we're recovered, you might want to put it just a bit to the right. Kind of depends. It's up to you. But it's probably somewhere right around in here, right? That's where I think it's going to be. Again, you'd have a little bit of leeway because I didn't really say where it was. But again, I was trying to give you direction. All right, so that takes care of the first sentence. The state of the economy tells us where aggregate demand is currently, right? And you should be able to tell me that at this level of aggregate, here's where our current GDP is, and here's where our current price level is, right? Yeah, probably. All right, so then we switch colors because now something has to change. What's going to change? What's moving left? Why? Exactly. So because government, there's an N there, is a non-CPI. I will say non-price. It means the same thing. Non-CPI determinant of aggregate demand falls. When aggregate demand falls, which way should I move it? Left. Give me a new aggregate demand curve. Now, normally when demand falls, back in the Chapter 3 world, what would you say happens next? When people quit buying stuff, what do you get? A surplus, right? So in theory, when people are buying less, it's kind of the same thing. It's just that at the macro or the aggregate level, we tend not to say that. But you could put it in there, right? You could kind of say, surplus starts. So that it matches with what we did back in Chapter 3 and 4. But at the macro level, you tend not to say that. You just kind of say that since demand is falling, what happens to CPI? Oh, CPI leveled off, right? CPI went down a little bit. Cool! CPI falls a bit. Or some. Or prices level off, one of the two. Right? In general, you would look at this as saying, if there was inflation, we experienced some disinflation. Which is good, right? Because that's always what we want, is to have prices leveling off, which would be nice. Unfortunately, what happened to GDP? Here's our new GDP. Oh, crap. GDP fell. When GDP falls, what happens to employment? GDP and unemployment always go together, folks. You could say unemployment rises if you like to talk about unemployment instead of employment. Either way. So those people who are screaming for the government to shave 20% off of its spending must be worried about prices being too high right now, right? That's what they're all screaming about, right? Because that's what they're fixing. Right? That's the only good thing about what they're asking for. From a macroeconomic perspective, they're basically saying that GDP is doing fine. We don't need to worry about it. Employment is fine. We don't need to worry about it. And that prices are going up too fast. We need to level them off. Because that's what this will do. Yay, whoever says that this is what we should be doing. So, again, is this necessarily the truth behind all of that? Right? Part of what the argument would be, the reason some politicians are screaming for this. Why are they screaming for this? Wasteful spending, right? So their belief is that when this government spending goes down, that aggregate demand won't really fall. Because the government spending that they're shaving is not being used to produce real GDP anyways. It's all fake, right? Yeah. It's just this giving money away to poor people thing. Why would we do that? That doesn't raise GDP at all. Quit it, right? Let's make unemployment last about 2 weeks, and that's good enough, because they should be able to find a job by then, and then we can save the economy, right? Maybe 3 weeks? Yeah, as to what the argument is to where it goes and how it can be cut, I don't know, right? I don't know the government's book, so I can't tell you. But that's the idea behind it, is that the loss in government spending here would not reduce GDP, it would not reduce aggregate demand, it would just keep it right here. Anyways, there we are, first example. We will come back on Wednesday. We will do a bunch more of these examples. Please be ready to draw me an aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve on Wednesday for the quiz. So the quiz will be half Chapter 13, half Chapter 14. So Chapter 13 questions will be about inflation. The Chapter 14 things will be me giving you some sort of a stage of the economy. You need to draw aggregate demand and aggregate supply correctly. All right? And then there will probably be a little extra credit that says, if blah happens, tell me what happens to GDP, employment, and prices. All right? So no homework for Wednesday. We didn't quite get through Chapter 14. we need to do a lot more comfortable assigning homework. So have a 2-day break. Joe, did you turn me off? Thank you, sir.